Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back once again to the Pineland Speaker Series. We're very fortunate to have with us today Vanessa Tropiano. She works with Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve, one of the Commission's longtime partners in environmental education and a lot of other protection, particularly of the Mullica River watershed. And today we're going to learn about coastal flooding impacts, risk, and communication. And it's a program that JCNERR is usually how we refer to Jacques Cousteau as working on. And it's really about raising awareness to possible impacts, how to communicate those impacts to help us all prepare for, coastal flooding in particular, but some of the aspects that we know are coming with climate change. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Vanessa.
Thanks, Joel. Good morning, everybody. As Joel said, I'm Vanessa Tropiano. I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Jacques Cousteau Reserve located in Tuckerton. And as I'm sure you have figured out by now, today I'm talking about coastal flooding. And a lot of times the messages we see about flooding through the media, on the news, are about flooding at the shore. But today's presentation hopes to point out that those impacts can really be broader. New Jersey's coastal zone extends into the eastern Pinelands, and the proximity of the Pinelands to the Atlantic Ocean, plus the influence of the tidal rivers and creeks that flow through the area, means that coastal hazards like flooding, storms, sea level rise can be felt in the Pinelands area. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the risks and impacts associated with coastal hazards are, what's going on to adapt at different levels of government, and some upcoming communication efforts that I am working on in my program. So first, a little bit about the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve. We are one of a national network of 29 coastal reserves that are managed in partnership by NOAA and a state partner in each state. And in our state, our partner is Rutgers. So I'm actually an employee of Rutgers University. The purpose of the reserve system is to manage estuaries through scientific research, education and training, and stewardship. And so my role is that training leg of the program. And one of the main focuses of the training program at our reserve is building resilience to coastal hazards and specifically reducing flood risk. Our actual office is physically located in Tuckerton along Great Bay Boulevard, but our jurisdiction spans all of the colored areas you see on this map. And so we cover a wide range of different ecosystems and different land management agencies, all the way from Manahawkin down south to Absecon and then west over into Burlington County and Warren State Forest. So coastal New Jersey is much more than the shore. When we talk about coastal management in New Jersey, we're not just talking about the barrier islands or the Back Bay areas, but anywhere that there are tidal waterways. And so what the map on the left shows are the tidal waterways in New Jersey, and then also the municipalities that have tidal waterways in them. And so you can see that what we consider the coastal zone extends much farther inland than we usually think about. On the right, I've overlaid the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan area with those coastal zone municipalities. And so you can see that quite a bit of the Pinelands area is indeed coastal area. And so what that means is that many Pinelands communities are impacted by the same coastal hazards that impact what we consider the shore areas. So things like storm surge and sea level rise are important a little further inland too. This was evident in Sandy. The image on the left is a satellite image showing Sandy's approach towards New Jersey on October 29th. And the map on the right, the blue areas show the extent of Sandy's storm surge. And I would point out particularly, you can note the extent of the surge into the Mullica River and into the Great Egg Harbor River a little further south. And so you might say, okay, of course, major hurricanes have geographically broad effects across the entire state, but maybe sea level rise is a little bit more questionable how that impacts in inland areas. And so the impacts of sea level rise are much more incremental, but they are being felt across the state. This is a graph that shows the tide level at the Atlantic City tide gauge from 1911 until present. We look at specifically Atlantic City because it's the oldest continuously operating tide gauge in our state. So it gives a good picture of how sea level rise has changed over time. And so this graph doesn't show estimates like we often think about with sea level rise. It shows the actual rise over the past century. And the total is that about 4 millimeters per year, sea level has gone up, and that has caused about a 1.35 feet rise over the last century. And so this is how we know sea level is rising. But that begs the question, is flooding really getting worse? And is it because of sea level rise? And the answer is complex. Sea level is rising. We know that from the graph that I just showed. And so flood levels are rising in association. Development and impervious surface is increasing everywhere pretty much. And so stormwater runoff is also getting worse. But at the same time, communities are making improvements to infrastructure and to planning to reduce flood impacts. And so when we ask the question, is flooding really getting worse? The answer is complex. And it really is that in some locations, yes, but in other locations, no. But what does this really all mean in the Pinelands? Sea level rise has an impact on tidal rivers. When the water level rises in the ocean, wherever the ocean is connected to, you're going to see impacts in those water bodies as well. We can monitor some of these impacts with the work we do at the Jacques Cousteau Reserve. And so this map on the left shows some of our monitoring stations within the reserve. And I want you to pay special attention to Lower Bank, which is our furthest upstream on the Mullica monitoring station. One of the things we're measuring at these stations is salinity, or the saltiness of the water. So this map shows salinity at that Lower Bank monitoring station over the 8-year period from 2008 until 2016. And we see these crazy spikes in salinity, which we know are associated with major storms that had a storm surge where salt water was pushed up the river. So the connection between sea level rise and this increased salinity is that it's really an additive effect. We have our current normal water level, and then we have sea level rise on top of that. And when you put storm surge on top of that, you're seeing water going higher and further inland. It's just water building on top of itself as you add these additional factors. So in the Barrier Islands, we often see flooded streets. That's the picture I showed, a few slides back. But in the Pinelands, the impacts are felt differently. You might not see that same level of street level flooding that you see in the places near the ocean. But one thing we do see in the Pinelands is ghost forests. And these are areas where specifically Atlantic white cedar trees are dying off over time from saltwater inundation and also from rising groundwater levels from beneath. Large areas were impacted during Sandy. That's what you're seeing in this photograph. But there also are more incremental effects happening over time with sea level rise along tidal water bodies. And that's what we're looking at in this photo. So if we look at multiple different areas of forests along tidal water bodies over time, these maps are showing the tree line measured at 1940 and then measured again at 2015. And what we see in almost every map here is that the forest edges have shifted landward over time away from the water body. The level of impact varies at the different locations. For example, for the Little Egg, we see that not much of a shift has happened. Somewhere like Delmont, we see that there has been a major shift back of the tree line. but the pattern is the same. And so we see this pattern happening in all different forested areas. So this graph is, or this map is I guess it's not a map or a graph, it's a graphic. It's a little bit complicated, but it helps explain why this ghost forest phenomenon is happening. Scientists have found that there are two main causes. The first one is that groundwater levels are rising linked to sea level rise. So the idea is that as the water level goes up in the ocean, the impacts are felt in the underlying groundwater. And so this graphic shows the level before sea level rise and then the groundwater rising after sea level rise. And that degree of rise depends very much on where you are and, you know, on factors that are beyond my understanding, but it is a pattern that we see. And so soils get saturated in low-lying areas, especially when there's a lot of rainfall, and that stresses the forest vegetation. These forests were not adapted to be in such wet soils. The second major cause of ghost forests is increased saltwater inundation from storm surge and very high tides. And this one is a little bit easier to understand. It's the idea that when the tide is very high or there's a storm surge, the water just comes up and floods a forested area. And sea level rise makes this happen more often and lasts longer when it does. And so this is just a photo of the Mullica River coming up across the road and flooding a forested area. And so as this happens more and more, these trees, of course, were not adapted to grow in salt water, and so it can cause die-off. Looking at the big picture, part of what's happening here is the existing salt marsh along these tidal areas are migrating into areas that are now forest. And what we call this is Marsh Retreat. This map shows the expected areas that would transition into marsh at 2 feet of sea level rise, which is expected to happen over the next 50 years or so. And so the pink areas are what we call marsh retreat zones. These are areas that are mostly now forest, but as sea level rises, we expect to see this ghost forest phenomenon continue to happen as the marsh moves backwards with the rising water level. So that's the impact of marsh retreat and ghost forests in the Pinelands area, but there's another kind of retreat that could also impact the Pinelands as conditions worsen along the Jersey Shore. So this cartoon makes light of it, but the idea is that as erosion and flooding becomes worse and worse in shore areas, people are going to have to start to think about where to go. Overall, there's 3 big categories of response to sea level rise, flooding, and coastal erosion. You can resist the incoming water, so things like seawalls or bulkheads to just hold the water back. You can do what they call accommodate the rise in water, which is something like raising your house, elevating your house so that the water, when it comes up, can just go beneath it. And then the third one is retreat, which is moving back from the water. And so we call it managed retreat. It's considered a sea level rise adaptation strategy where a planned decision is made to move back from the rising ocean. So people and infrastructure are relocated inland in anticipation of hazards in an organized fashion. The thing is, along the Jersey Shore, where do we relocate to? As waterfront areas more frequently look like the conditions in this photo, people retreating from coastal communities might exert pressure on the Pinelands to accommodate the displacement of both people who live there and businesses. In Ocean County alone, there's tens of thousands of homes that are at risk from about a 1.5 foot rise in sea level rise, which could happen by about the year 2050. And the majority of these homes are in areas or in municipalities that have some land in the Pinelands. So we can expect that there'll be shifting development patterns and a changing tax base. And as people shift away from the barrier islands and from the bayfront areas, there's the potential to burden Pinelands communities as that shift occurs. Of course, you know, I'm not saying this is certainly going to happen, but it's something that we think about as we plan for future sea level rise. And so that brings us to this question of, well, okay, we know these things are happening, we're monitoring them, but what can we do about it? And many of you have probably heard the term coastal resilience. It's quite the buzzword nowadays. And it describes the actions that government and residents are taking to be prepared for the impacts of sea level rise and other coastal hazards. The idea is that if we plan and take action now in advance of future risks and impacts, we'll be more prepared to survive and thrive in the face of those impacts. And so it's not just bouncing back after a storm, for example, but bouncing forward to actually be ready and be better after the storm. But building coastal resilience is really a puzzle. It's a puzzle of different people and places and interests. And part of that is the result of the fact that New Jersey's coast, we looked at the map, is so very varied. And just like the New Jersey coast is varied, what goes into planning for resilience is also made up of many complementary and diverse parts. The resilience of a whole community and the whole state at the same time depends on the resilience of all different sectors of the community. So the government, the residents, the businesses, the natural environment, the built environment, everybody has to be planning and taking steps to be resilient. You can raise your home, but if the infrastructure isn't also updated or adapted, then you're surrounded by water and you don't have much of a community. And so when we plan for resilience, we think about this whole community picture. And one of the biggest parts of this is connecting the science that we have with communication to stakeholders and to decision makers. And that's really where my job lies, is in that communication piece. It's natural for us when we think about planning for the future to look back on what has already happened. In New Jersey, I think we all often think about Sandy when we think about flooding. I've already mentioned Sandy a bunch of times, and I'm sure I'll mention it again before we're done here. But in the case of sea level rise impacts, we do have to look to the future. Unfortunately, we have great science in New Jersey that can inform that decision-making going forward. Rutgers has used the latest and greatest science to come up with sea level rise estimates specifically for our state. The first report was completed in 2016, and then it was updated again in 2019. And the report makes the science accessible for people to actually understand and use, because it's really important that we understand the numbers if we're going to make decisions based on them. This is a table from the report. It's what we refer to when we talk about future sea level rise potential. You've probably already noticed, I think I rattled off a few when I was when I was talking about the ghost forest and the potential sea level rise there. But where I get that is from this chart from the Rutgers report. So the way the chart works is you can pick your year of interest along the top row. And then the column on the left shows you the percent chance of a certain level of sea level rise in that year. So for example, if I go to year 2050 and I move down the column, I can see there's about a 50% chance that sea level rise will meet or exceed 1.4 feet in the year 2050. And so we often refer to that number when we're planning for the 30-year planning horizon. As you move out into the future, you see these low, moderate, and high. And that's because as we move further out, the modeling for sea level rise has to be based on greenhouse gas emissions. And so the low, moderate, high refers to how much greenhouse gases have continued to be released across the globe. So knowing all this science, what is the government doing about coastal flooding? One of the things you might be most familiar with and can be most visible is the Army Corps of Engineers beach renourishment projects. This is a photo of the nourished dune after a nor'easter in Harvey Cedars on Long Beach Island in 2017. But the idea here is that this dune has done its job. If it wasn't there, what is now a cliff in the dune could have been a cliff of the houses along the ocean front. And so it's offered the protective value that they built it for. Most of the federal efforts carried out by the Army Corps of Engineers are a partnership between the state and the municipality. And the state of New Jersey dedicates $25 million a year through a specific shore protection fund for these projects. The Army Corps has a really well-developed program of beachfront protection at this point. There's beach renourishment projects in almost every municipality up and down our Atlantic coast. And now they're looking to the more inland areas to work on protection. The New Jersey Back Bay study is looking at flood protection solutions for the bay side of the islands and the mainland and the tidal rivers. You can see the expanse of the study areas in the colored areas on the map. They split the coastline into 5 regions to look at different flood protection methods for each region, and they're considering a combination of tactics in each region, which range from things like storm surge barriers, which is what you see on the bottom left. Those are actually huge floodgates, basically, that would go across some of the inlets that could be closed when a storm surge is coming, as well as things that we're more familiar with, like home elevations, which you see in the top left. In addition to the state's role in sharing the costs of the Army Corps' efforts, the state also recently released a coastal resilience plan, which offers guidance for policies and regulations and how they will allocate funding in the coastal zone into the future. Another state planning effort that's underway is a coastal ecological restoration and adaptation plan. The goal of this plan is to identify areas and projects that could host future ecological restoration projects that would have a value for not only increasing community flood resilience, but also improving ecosystem health and carbon sequestration. As you can see in the picture, there was a call to nominate projects that did end on May 15th. The idea here was that stakeholders from all over the state could nominate areas that they were concerned about the ecological health of, and also areas where maybe they had an idea for a project or a planned project already underway. And although that deadline is closed, there will be future opportunities to nominate more projects. This is considered to be kind of a living plan that will continue to be updated over time. At the local level, many municipalities are also doing work for flood resilience. And this generally consists of either engineering or land use measures. So many of the engineering measures are efforts to keep the water out or move the water away from the development. And then they're also exploring land use changes, which would shift future development away from the most vulnerable areas. And I talked earlier, about a very geographically expansive shift of leaving some areas in managed retreat, but that's not really what I mean here. In this case, we're talking about, if you're developing a 45-acre parcel and there's the opportunity to, concentrate development in the safest 25 acres of it, that would be a land use change rather than just developing the whole thing in a flood zone where you have a lot more vulnerability after that development project. With all of these efforts, communication is key, and that's where my role lies at the Jacques Cousteau Reserve. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about some of the communications projects that I'm working on currently. The one that I am most excited about is called MyCoast. It's a partnership with the New Jersey DEP, and it's a portal to collect photos of flooding and valued coastal places across the state. We are actually the 10th state in the country to start using MyCoast. It's a public tool to document flooding, and we really hope to see it over time become like the go-to tool to capture flooding and to kind of create a two-way street with the public and decision makers to show areas that are being impacted and areas that need some attention. And again, this is for all of New Jersey's coastal areas, like I highlighted in the map at the beginning, from coastal forests to rivers to bays to the ocean. The idea is that empowering people to connect the coastal places where they live or work or play with potential flood impacts is a really critical first step in raising awareness, which then leads to actions to decrease flood risks over time. So the way MyCoast works is you add your picture. Anyone can add a picture. The portal automatically pulls in background data about tides and weather conditions at the location and time of your photo. And then it creates a little report that can be used by coastal managers and leaders to make decisions. MyCoast works as an app or a web page. This is a picture of what the app looks like. If you go to download it, there's just one national MyCoast app, and then it'll use your location to load the correct New Jersey portal. You can also use it as the website. If you go to the website, you have to use the specific New Jersey web address, which you see up on the screen, mycoast.org/NJ. And it will ask you to register whether you use the app or the website. And then you have the option of adding high water photos or photos of places you love. So the way it works is if you go to the high water photos, for example, you get a map showing where all the different photos have been taken, and you can see a stream of recently added photos. If you click on any one of the recently added photos, you can go to the photo report. This is one that was submitted a few weeks ago near the Mullica River. So the cool thing about the way this works is we've given the option for the person uploading the photo to say what the source of the flooding was. Was it a river? Was it the bay? Was it the ocean? And then the cause of the flooding. Was it high tide? Was it a storm surge? Or was it a really heavy rain event? And you can pick multiple for the cause of the flooding because oftentimes that is what's happening on the ground. Over here on the right is what the app itself pulls in. And so you get from your nearest tide station to the photo, how long it's been from high tide, and then the predicted high tide height. So on this one, you can see that it's about an hour after high tide, and the high tide was predicted to be about 2.7 feet. Also gives you a weather overview. You can see that at the time of this photo, there had been a significant amount of rain. So we can imagine that rain is also contributing to the high water level we see. And then I want to point out that it also pulls in data from river gauges. And that I'm just pointing it out to reiterate the fact that this isn't just for the shore. It's also for inland areas. And that's why we've included the riverine gauges as well. Same format for the places we love photos, and the same report. If you were to go and click on one of the photos, you would get that report with the weather and tide data pulled in. Another specific feature that we added to New Jersey MyCoast is a tide function where you can go to the website, you can select your tide gauge, and you get your tides for the day, as well as the upcoming tide table for the month. And this is being drawn from NOAA. And of course, you could just go to NOAA and get the same information. But what's handy about this is you don't have to click through several screens, to get to New Jersey. You go to MyCoast and you are given just the tide gauges in New Jersey, so you can quickly find the tide for your area of interest. We launched MyCoast officially about 2 weeks ago with a 2021 Spring King Tide Photo Contest. It ran May 24th through 29th, which were the predicted highest tides of 2021 in New Jersey and along the Mid-Atlantic in general. We got about 55 photos submitted from a wide variety of coastal areas, and right now we're voting on them. So I encourage you to go to mycoast.org and cast your vote. There's 3 categories for winners, depending on the source of the flooding. So ocean, river, and bay. And the winners will be announced on June 21st. You have until next Wednesday, I think is the 16th, to get your vote in. And we plan to continue doing these King Tide photo contests. We'll probably do another in the fall and then do about 2 a year in conjunction with when the highest tides are predicted. So one more time, that's the URL if you want to go to the website, and then you can also download the MyCoast app and use it from your phone on either iPhone or Android. Another communication project we are working on with the NJDEP is a risk communication campaign that will run this summer. The campaign consists of 3 parts. There's going to be risk communication materials, so things like graphics about sea level rise, that sort of thing. There'll be a social media strategy where we're working with a communications consultant to develop social media posts throughout the summer that will help raise awareness about flood impacts in coastal areas. And there's also a community-based art grant program where four communities have been selected to install an art installation at some point in the next several months that helps communicate flooding risk and coastal hazards. This art installation is not a part of our community-based art program, but I wanted to give you an idea of the kind of thing that we're talking about, because I think it can be like a little bit of a stretch to say, okay, how do you communicate flooding or climate change through an art installation in a town? This is one in Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York. It's about ghost forests, which we were talking about earlier. And what they did here is they installed 49 Atlantic white cedar trees that had been cleared for forest management in the Pinelands, and put them up in the Madison Square Park to communicate about impacts of climate change. And so I think over the next few months or several months, it runs until November. They also have a series of public programs that will focus on nature-based solutions to climate change, and planting of trees and shrubs and that sort of thing in coordination with the exhibition. So I don't think any of our installations for our New Jersey project will be of quite this magnitude, but this is the kind of the idea behind what we're trying to accomplish. This is an example of one of the graphics that we are developing for the communications campaign. We've decided to focus the main message of the campaign on knowing your tides. The idea being that no matter where you are in the coastal area, knowing when the high tide is coming is directly connected to your flood risk. And we've developed this suite of 4 actions to take to be tide smart. And so I'm going to wrap up by talking about a couple of these. We've already talked about number 1, which is just knowing when your high tide is. We're sending people to the Know Your Tide site on MyCoast to check their tide information. The second one is downloading and using the MyCoast app to get a better idea of what flooding and flooding impacts can look like in your area. And then I'm going to focus on 3 and 4 for the next couple slides. So signing up for flood alerts and getting a better idea of what your actual flood risk is, where you live or where you vacation. So signing up for flood alerts, there are a number of different ways to get flood alerts, but one of the most common ones used by municipalities is Nixle.com. If you just go to Nixle.com, you can put in your zip code, and you have the opportunity to sign up with your phone to get mobile alerts to your phone. And they're just text messages when there is an emergency alert put out by your town or by your local police department. Now, caveat, these alerts are about much more than flooding, but they are local and really good either way. I get them for where I live in Point Pleasant. It can be anything from a power outage to a road closure to a flood. And a lot of the times it is flooding causing road closures, which is something you want to know. It's not something that's going to be on the news necessarily, but it's important for you in the place where you live. If you go to Nixle and you put in your zip code and nothing comes up, it may be that your municipality uses a different service. There are some other services that do the same thing. So if that happens, if it says that there's no data for your zip, I would just check with your municipality to see if they use another service. And if they do, sign up for that one. The other piece is understanding your flood risk. And for that, In New Jersey, we are fortunate to have what we call NJ Flood Mapper, which was created by Rutgers and in partnership with My Reserve and a bunch of other great state partners. If you go to the website at the bottom right corner, njfloodmapper.org, it brings you to the New Jersey Flood Mapper site. And this is the first screen that you'll see. I'm going to use some screenshots to give you an idea of how you can actually use the mapping tool to assess your flood risk. The first thing you can do is zoom into your area of interest by either just zooming in, or you can type your address or town in the search bar at the upper right. And so what I've done here is I typed in Sweetwater in the search bar, and it zoomed me into the location in Mullica Township along the Mullica River. And I want to look at aerial imagery instead of this gray map. So I can click on base maps over on the left, and I pick imagery or imagery hybrid. That way I can get an actual idea of what I'm looking at on the ground. So now I've added my aerial imagery to the map, and I'm ready to start looking at some different flooding hazards. So what I do is I go over to the left-hand side and I click the flood hazards menu. And you can see that there are a variety of different types of flood hazards to choose from. Where you are might depend which ones you want to look at. In this case, I'm going to take a look at sea level rise. And so as we saw on the table from the Rutgers report, it's expected that there's about a 50% chance of at least 1.4 feet of sea level rise by 2050. And so I'm going to put 2 feet onto the map and see what that looks like. The sea level rise option on the left-hand side, you can use that little drop down. I have it set to 2 feet, but you can set it from anything from, I think, 0 to 10 feet. Depending on what you want to look at or play around with. So you click the green add button, and that puts your sea level rise layer on the map. And so now I'm looking at potential sea level rise inundation with about 2 feet of sea level rise. And this is what you would expect the inundation to be each day at high tide with 2 feet of sea level rise. And so I can zoom in, I can look at my house, I can look at my grocery stores and see what my risk might look like in the coming years. Another thing I might want to check is my FEMA flood zone. And so to do that, I can go back over to the flood hazards options on the left side, and I can add FEMA flood zones to the map, which is the last one on the list. If I add that, I can now see my FEMA flood zones overlaid. The flood zones by FEMA are mapped across the country, and they reflect varying levels of flood risk. And it is specifically for flood insurance rates, but it's also helpful, even if you're not looking at it for that purpose, to get an idea of what the assessed flood risk is in your area. So each of the colored zones reflects a severity or a type of flooding in the area. On this map, we're looking at the blue as the 1% annual chance flood. It's considered the high risk area, and it means that in any given year, there's a 1% chance that a flood will occur. In the orange areas, those are the moderate risk areas, and there we're looking at a 0.2% chance of a flood in any given year. And so, like I said, these maps are the basis of federal flood insurance, but they can also give you an idea of your individual flood risk at your property. So what does it really mean, though? I know the 1% and 0.2% are kind of confusing to conceptualize. I'm certainly confused by them, but the idea is that in the blue high risk areas, if you have a 30-year mortgage, there's at least a 1 in 4 chance that flooding will occur on your home during that 30-year time span. And for that reason, you're required to purchase flood insurance if you get a federally backed mortgage. In the low to moderate risk areas, so the orange areas and beyond, if you live in that area, the property owner can get a little bit lower cost flood insurance because you're outside of the high risk zone. It's also important to remember, though, if you live in one of these areas, it doesn't mean your house will never flood. There are lots of FEMA claims on houses that are outside of the flood risk areas. And I think with that, that's actually my last slide. So thank you. And we'll move on to questions.
Vanessa, thank you very much. That was a very detailed overview of some of the pressing issues we have with sea level rise, and a great way to get some resources to kind of know your situation, understand your particular risk, and really good specific information that anybody can use to assess just exactly what the risk is. So I really appreciate that presentation.
My pleasure.
If anybody has questions, now would be a good time to call, and we'll bring you into the conversation and see if we can help you. Yeah, it's pretty dramatic when you really see how far inland a lot of those risks are. That one map where you showed the Pinelands boundary and then the areas that were flooded with Sandy just really knocks it home that you don't have to be right on the coast or right on the bay. You certainly can have, particularly in the Pinelands, with all the rivers and streams, you can certainly have some impacts much further inland than you would expect.
For sure, yeah. I use that Sandy surge map in almost all of my presentations because I think it just, no matter where you are, it's just super interesting to see. But it also is just, a real life reminder of what already happened, which really helps to think about, what could happen in the future.
Yep. Yeah, and what could happen in the future, it seems like a lot of those large intense events are happening more often. So the possibilities, I think, are greater today than they once were. It seems like things are more extreme, and we do have a caller, so I'll bring them in.
Okay.
Hello, you're live on the air with your call.
Hello, is there any plans to maybe distribute this webinar to like realtors or planning boards? It was very, very informative, and it's like, wow, and very understandable, I think, for a layperson. I think anybody looking to move into this area or develop would greatly benefit from this webinar.
Yeah, thanks. So I give variations of this webinar all the time, and I kind of just adapt it for what locations I'm in. This is actually the first time I've ever given it for a Pinelands oriented audience. So I'm glad that it all made sense to you. But part of my mission at the Jacques Cousteau Reserve, and specifically the Coastal Training Program, is not so much to bring outreach and education to the public, but specifically to people like planning boards and realtors and municipal officials, who are the people really making the decisions on the ground. So yeah, we definitely share this information. And if there are specific groups that you think this specific webinar would be appropriate for, I'd love to spread the word.
Okay, I'll keep your email. Keep your email handy. One other question: do you have like any plans on marketing something like coastal resilience as something to be brought forward? Like after Sandy, they had like the Restore the Shore, the T-shirts, the bumper stickers, things like that were fundraisers. Is there any sort of coastal resilience sort of plan going forward to help fundraise?
We don't have anything about fundraising. That's kind of outside of my purview. I love the idea, though. Certainly, I love the idea. I'd love to think about it more. The state, as I mentioned, recently released their coastal resilience plan, so it's something that's gaining a lot of momentum on its own, and certainly isn't just going to fade away. I think I only see this becoming more and more of a focus at the state and local level over time.
One of the places that you might consult with, the New Jersey State Library, which is where I work, has like a disaster planning office where they work particularly with libraries and like archives and different things. And they have a marketing arm that they work with to help get plans and things out. You might consult with Michelle Stricker is the lady's name who runs the disaster planning.
Okay, great. I wrote that down. I will reach out to Michelle after this.
Okay, greatly appreciate that. Thank you again for a
Thanks.
wonderful and informative webinar.
Thank you.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, that's great. And it is really, like you said in the presentation, about raising awareness and all the tools and that we can utilize to better get the word out, to better get understanding. Appreciation of the situation is going to be favorable as far as people knowing about the problem and taking actions to address the problem. So that's great.
Yeah, and I love her idea of, I had never thought of the New Jersey State Library so much of the time, both because of where I'm located and just because, like it or not, it's the shore that gets the most attention a lot of the times when we talk about these topics. But we're always trying to figure out ways like, how do we expand this message to truly be statewide? And so I love hearing about new organizations that we haven't interacted with before who might be good partners for this kind of thing.
Yeah, they're a great resource. I know they have helped us promote our webinars, and they have certainly got the word out with a number of the Pineland Speaker Series in particular. So they've been a good asset as far as bringing more people to view and know that we have this series going on. Yeah, New Jersey is so diverse, but it's so small in so many ways that even up in the highlands or in the rocky part of the state, everything does sort of trickle down and have an effect. So we're even though they're geographically different and vastly look different, but we're all pretty much in the same boat in a lot of ways, and everything does kind of affect each other.
Yep.
Besides the king tide, you talked about a couple of your other things. Is there any other upcoming events or communication strategies that you guys have going on this summer?
No, so really the focus of the summer will be the risk communication campaign. We are also involved in several other projects, but they don't have quite the statewide scope as that one does. And so what we've done there, I didn't get into too deep of detail because I wasn't sure about our time, but we've partnered with education organizations across the state. So that's how I connected with you, Joel. Originally, I think I was reaching out about the communications campaign. And the idea is that by, partnering with these other educators who are doing their own outreach, maybe not directly related to flooding, or maybe related to flooding in a different way than what I usually focus on. We're really leveraging and expanding the reach of the campaign, which is always the goal, I think. I would also, I didn't mention this, very soon for those community-based art installations, they're going to release the towns where they're going to be featured, and I think the dates when they will have the installations up. So I would encourage everybody to look out for that from the NJDEP. They're the ones who are going to announce it, because that should be really cool. So I know some of them are, tangible things like structures or sculptures or something like that, but I think some of them are like performances, and so they'll be based around a community event that people can actually attend and see the performance, and I'm sure it'll be like a little festival, so that'll be something to watch out for. I think it'll be really cool.
All right, that's awesome. Well, on that note, I think I want to thank you again. It was a great presentation, very informative, and we're doing our best to get the word out there and make people aware of the situation. I see your emails there on the screen, so if anybody has further questions for Vanessa, they could email her, and we'll go from there. And Next week, we have a similar program. We're working with another Rutgers University professor, Dr. Rick Lathrop, is going to talk about a web app and mapping system that they have to talk about specifically New Jersey forest. And that'll be next program for next Thursday. So on that note, I will end the live broadcast.